All right, this time I'm going to talk about transcendental arguments. I want to give an introduction to them. And ultimately, maybe this will be a mid-level examination of the question. I've had a lot of commenters and people have requested this type of a discussion. I'm a little bit sick, forgive me. The first thing to consider is that what is a transcendental argument? Well, a transcendental argument is basically, it is a logical argument. It is a type of argumentation, but they have a different form compared to most types of arguments or propositions or statements as they would be displayed in a syllogism or an argument or so forth. So transcendental arguments are unique. They are something closer to what we call apophatic theology. In Christian theology, biblical theology, it's in Jewish theology too, and I suppose Islamic. There's the idea that God's attributes are not directly known, in the sense of we don't know as humans what it is to be infinite. We don't know what omniscience is. We can give an explanation of what omniscience or infinity is, but generally speaking, when we do that, we're doing it by showing what it is not. And so negative theology, via negativa, or apophatic theology, is the theology of what something isn't. And it's what something isn't when we're talking about something like God, simply because we don't have a direct experience or knowledge of what it is to be something beyond what we know as humans. We don't know directly what omnipotence is. We have an idea of it, but the idea of it, again, comes from the negations of what it is not. It is not to be limited. It is not to be, a contained level of human power. It's beyond that, right? So a lot of times the divine attributes then ultimately are apophatic, or if we talk about God's nature, which we don't have any knowledge of, we don't know what it is to be the divine nature. We'll never know that, and so it is spoken of negatively. In the same way, when it comes to logic, or when it comes to human reasoning and argumentation, it would seem to follow as well that when we talk about the ultimate principles of logic, or how logic works, or human cognition, or the forms of argumentation, we come to similar types of principles. So a transcendental argument, a good example of this is, the first example is, Aristotle gives this when he's arguing with the sophists, and this comes up in the Metaphysics. And the sophists, or the relativists of his day, come along and say, well, Aristotle, how do we know that the law of non-contradiction is true? Because you've got all these fancy arguments, and you've got all these logical laws and all this, but how do we know that these laws are right? Maybe these laws are wrong. And Aristotle gives a transcendental argument. He says, well, when you, as the sophist, try to refute the law of non-contradiction, you actually prove it in the act of denying it, because you're using it in the process of denying it. When you're saying that it's contradictory, the law of non-contradiction is contradictory. That is a contradiction. So it's unavoidable. In other words, you can't be involved in this kind of a logical process, or in any kind of logic or mathematics or anything like that, without if you deny the fundamental principles or maxims, you end up contradicting yourself. And so Aristotle says this is actually a unique form of argument that I'm giving. right? So a lot of people have all these misunderstandings. They think, well, that's not actually an argument. That's not, you're just playing word games. No. This is not word games, right? This is not word games any more than, say, Gödel's theorems were word games, because he's using a transcendental kind of argument for number sets. In the same way, when you talk about logic, when you talk about the law of non-contradiction, what we're actually saying is, what is the logic behind logic? That's ultimately where we're going. So it's a question of meta-logic. So that's the first example that Aristotle gives, and we might say that it's an indirect argument. When Aristotle gives that argument against the sophist, it's indirect. It's not it's not a positive claim. It's not an empirical claim. It's an indirect, more of an a priori claim, intended to refute the sophist through reductio ad absurdum, which is reducing the opponent's position to absurdity. Now, a lot of people will make the criticism about this kind of argument that, well, yeah, but just a reductio, because it's an indirect argument, it doesn't prove anything positive. Well, that's not true. In other words, just because an argument is stated in an indirect form, it can also be reversed and put into a positive form, and you could do that with any kind of argument. It just depends. You could just universalize it and make it a universal claim. So the fact that it's an indirect argument really has nothing to do with the force or power of the argument. So that's a misapplied criticism that a lot of people who either don't understand or don't like transcendental arguments gives. They say, well, it's just it's just because it's an indirect argument, it doesn't really prove much. It's also not true, because there are all kinds of things that are implied by an indirect argument like this, that just because they're implied and not immediately stated doesn't mean that they don't necessarily follow, right? So it's kind of like a trick where the person who rejects this kind of argument, or the force of this kind of an argument, is saying, well, because you haven't stated it, therefore it's not true. Well, in other words, if I say 2 + 2 = 4, right, I haven't immediately included the number 1 anywhere there, right? But the number 1 is implied. It's implied in making up 2 and making up 2 and then making up 4. So just because something isn't immediately included, it does not follow that it is therefore not necessarily implied. So when we have an indirect argument such as the law of non-contradiction is contradictory that the sophists gave, when we point out that that is itself a contradiction, we are not merely saying only that. There are all kinds of other things that are implied there, one of which is that the law of non-contradiction is true. So just because the argument as it's immediately directly stated, just because it doesn't also state explicitly that the law of non-contradiction is true, that's the very thing that it demonstrates. Why? Because when the sophist denies the law of non-contradiction, he assumes it. So that's the thing. So it's almost like, yeah, in one sense, what we're trying to prove is maybe is cloaked or implied a bit, but that really has nothing to do with the status of whether or not it's true or false. And that brings me to the next crucial point that is commonly misunderstood about these types of arguments, which is that, well, transcendental arguments are not that good because they don't prove anything, right? They might give us a kind of indicator of questioning radical skepticism, but they don't prove anything. So you can never have some transcendental argument that proves God, because transcendental arguments by their very nature can't prove anything. Well, that also is, again, a misunderstanding, very similar to the misunderstanding I mentioned a moment ago. It was kind of a cousin, an evil offspring misunderstanding of the first. So, in other words, when we say, well, when we talk about proving something, this is a very difficult, loaded philosophical question because while there may be a common sense notion of what it is to prove something, in another sense, what do we actually mean when we prove something? Right? So this gets into a whole long historical debate in the subject of epistemology and how do we know and so forth. How do we have certainty? Is certainty possible? Well, the first thing to point out is that just like when we mentioned apophaticism about God's nature or highly esoteric principles or some abstruse principle of logic, or mathematics or maybe physics or something like that. There are always aspects of things that are unknown to us. There are always things that we don't know about an object or about another person or about an idea or a principle. So this veiled or cloaked nature of everything ultimately is always going to be the case. It's inescapable because we're finite. We'll never have omniscience. So we have two options when we realize that, which is something that I don't think anybody would deny that. Unless there may be some crazy sectarian who thinks that he has omniscience or something, who thinks he's Jesus or thinks he's the Messiah or something like that. Generally speaking, most people will not think they have omniscience. So, given that we don't, and we probably won't ever, unless you're some transhumanist who thinks he's going to be like a great God computer or something one day, we are left with the option of saying, well, either we have no knowledge then, and all knowledge is uncertain, we're total relativists and skeptics, or there's some other way by which we can have some sort of degree of certainty. So we might talk about degrees of certainty. Some philosophers speak of warranted and unwarranted beliefs. In other words, do I have significant epistemic justification to believe in one thing over another thing? And we can also talk about, empirical claims, different levels of status for, something like investigating a murder and, coming to conclusions based on the evidence. But what we see here is that clearly things like empirical observations related to science or a murder case or something like that, judge and jury, have a higher level of doubt or reasonable doubt or skepticism because they're empirical claims, as opposed to something like, say, 2 + 2 = 4, right? So we just tend to intuitively think and believe, and I think rightly so, that mathematical claims or claims that deal with ideational, we might say, logical, conceptual principles, maxims, things like that, tend to be a little more objective, and they tend to have an a priori necessary quality about them, right? So there's not, excluding questions of really, really, advanced mathematics, about numbers and number theory. If we look at something like, there's no new facts that we're going to gain, tomorrow or, through some research in a lab that's going to make 2 + 2 not equal 4. We have a clear, justified, certain belief that tomorrow 2 plus 2 is still going to be 4. Whether or not tomorrow, there's still going to be a Dairy Queen at the end of my street, I have less certainty, right? So that is an example of how there's different levels of what it is to be certain about things, and how different beliefs and experiences are categorized in, levels of justification for those beliefs. And so a lot of times with the people who are very critical of or misunderstand this type of transcendental argumentation, they're not keeping that in mind. So they're coming at this and thinking that either, we can't have any certainty, or more often than not, it's, the Dawkins, Darwin, materialist type person who encounters a transcendental argument for God, and so the first thing he goes to is wanting to show that a transcendental argument doesn't prove anything. And why not? Well, because it's not empirically verifiable. And that's one of the most common objections that we get to this type of argumentation. Well, that's really just, grade school level response, because it's not even taking into account all the different levels of, certainty and uncertainty that we have about different beliefs and different types of things. So when we talk about proofs, when we talk about what we know and what we don't know, there's always a level of uncertainty. There's always a level of veiled character about any object. Here's another helpful example in this regard. One of the points that phenomenology is good in bringing out, which is a branch of a school of philosophy, is that if you were to take any object, right? If let's say let's say for the sake of argument, we wanted to start with our empirical experience, any object of perception, any object in our field of vision, is always going to be limited by what we can immediately see. So if I'm looking at a book, the book has a whole bunch of pages inside and it has a back side that's not immediately perceptible to me. I would have to turn the book around. But alas, when I turn the book around, I no longer see the front. When I open the book, I'm limited to only seeing 2 pages. And then no longer the front or the back. And this is true of any object, right? If I'm standing outside of my house, I see the outside of the house. I'm limited, as to where I don't see the inside or the backside. So this is called, in philosophy, the horizon of an object. And so just any empirical object itself having this horizon, this limiting, veiled aspect, should show us that no empirical claim it really ultimately is as strong as any sort of empiricist would like it to be. It's always limited, right? Now, that does not mean that we don't have knowledge or that we don't have certainty, right? Humans have this tendency to always jump to the radical, polar, pendulum opposite of whatever it is they've just discovered. So, if you're a philosophy student or something like this and you come to this point and you realize this, then the tendency is to say, well, then we don't have any knowledge. We just leap to the opposite end of the spectrum, and I'm a total relativist, I'm a total skeptic. Nothing can be known because there's a horizon of objects, or there's, we can always call into question any kind of empirical observation. And so we might be a Humean skeptic. Well, we don't have to go that route either. There's another way. And so what I'm talking about is this mediating, sensible, I think, way to approach these questions based around transcendental arguments. And what transcendental arguments do is it really ultimately is a very revolutionary way of looking at all these kinds of questions as it applies to logic, mathematics, metaphysics, and knowledge. Because we can say, yes, we do have limitations on our empirical knowledge, but that doesn't mean that we don't have a warranted justification for our empirical observations and beliefs. And it also doesn't mean that logical and mathematical principles are therefore empirical or dubious, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not dubious. It is not. Equally as doubtful as is there a Dairy Queen at the end of my street. All right, so we already kind of have this sense that there's a difference between those two kinds of questions. The logical and mathematical types of questions seem to give us a higher level of a priori certainty because they have this intuitive, certain, self-evident quality about them that no facts of experience are going to interrupt or change or alter the invariant immaterial aspects that they have, right? The number 5 is never going to turn into the number 8 and, the whole universe suddenly be cast into, chaos. We have whatever the highest level of certainty is that a human can have. We can have that about those types of things. Do you see what I'm saying? So we can always, in other words, a better way to explain this is that, well, yes, human knowledge is limited. It's apophatic in character. But whatever it is, right, that is the highest level of certainty, 2 plus 2 equals 4 type certainty, that type of certainty can be had. And it is had. It may not always apply to every single thing that we experience. Is your girlfriend cheating on you? That's something empirical. You don't know. Maybe she is, maybe she isn't. But regardless, 2 plus 2 equals 4 definitely has this non-empirical, independent character or property about it, whereby it functions to always be the case universally. And it's not bound by time either, or locale. So, when we talk about knowing things, what I'm going to say is that the transcendental argument or transcendental argumentation is not like empirical claims. It's more like the kinds of claims I was talking about before. It's more like a logical claim, more like a mathematical claim, more like a strict, necessary, propositional type of claim, right? And it follows necessarily like the number 4 follows in the 2 plus 2 equals equation. So when we look at questions of metalogic, and we don't want to get too fancy here, too fancy pants, but it makes me think of that Jerky Boys, fancy. All we mean by metalogic is, what is the logic of logic? When we look at 2 plus 2 equals 4, we're just looking at the first level of that simple addition problem. But math theory asks the questions of, well, what are the numbers there? What is a number? How is it that number exists? How is it that the combination of these two things equals one thing, even though it's two things combining, right? So the problem of the one and the many in philosophy is kind of a fundamental problem of math theory or number theory. In the same way, in logic, when we have these logical claims and postulates and then, necessary conclusions or fallacies or so forth, we can ask another question about, well, how is it that logic works? Why does it work? What's going on here? Because, as I said before, logic is part of everyday life. It's part of everything. It's used in the in science, philosophy of science is based on logic. And, it's something like induction, learning from trial and error. We expect the future to be like the past, right? The problem of induction. Well, how is it that something that undergirds empirical knowledge is so elusive and yet so certain, right, and has that apophatic character about it? Well, the explanation that I think is the best and that I think makes the most coherent sense and kind of brings all this together is a transcendental argument. In other words, there are preconditions for the possibility of experience, right? And that's very important. So if by chance any fellow nerds are taking notes, I would highlight that. What is a transcendental argument? Simply put, it's a precondition for the possibility of experience. And we don't necessarily have to keep it, only in this, subjective human sense, right? So it's not like, if there were no humans, there would not be any objective metaphysical principles or categories. There still would be. But just insofar as we are at this point in this discussion talking about human knowledge, we can say, well, a transcendental argument or a transcendental category or a presuppositional category is a precondition for the possibility of there being experience at all. So, excuse me. Before we get further down that road, I want to make the point as well that let's say, let's take an example of, this is one I always use because I think it's really good. Because language is very, very good about demonstrating transcendental categories and thinking. Right now, as I'm talking to you, through this little iPod, we're having, not an immediate, but a human communication exchange. So I'm forming sentences and spitting out words, and hopefully they make sense, and hopefully you're receiving them. And they are going into your ears, and your brain is processing them, and so forth. So most people in philosophy, most scientists, right, they come to this and they say, they have all these naive assumptions about what's going on here between this human interchange, or you and another friend talking. Any human exchange of conversation, information, doesn't matter what. Most people approach and they say, well, this is a dude who's pretentious dude who's rambling on about philosophy, and what it is this a series of determined chemical biological processes that have triggered the neurons in his head to spit out these sound waves through his vocal cords, and that this produces similar chemical and neurological reaction in the receiver, and because the social situation in which they exist has decided to accept certain sounds as symbolizing other things. When he talks about cats and dogs and philosophy and whatever, these are social constructs that are registering in the other brain, and so based on empirical research and sociological sciences, these are all just material events, predetermined and caused, and blah, 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 blah. So the whole field of modern science and modern philosophy, for the most part, is just completely dominated by that. just that one level, the here and the now, and a purely materialistic, isomorphic, one-level approach to explaining all of what's going on there. And there's a whole history of hundreds of years of philosophy and scientific revolution and so forth as to why that is, as to why everyone just assumes all this stuff. It's just this dogmatic assumption across the board that everybody has, that most people have, that all that medieval Plato, Christian, biblical superstition, metaphysics is gone. We've grown out of all that. We're progressive man now, and we don't need any of that, and we are all now enlightened Darwinian materialists, blah, blah, blah. Well, the transcendental philosopher, or presuppositionalist, or so forth, comes to this example and says, well, wait a minute. You would have me believe, Mr. Atheist, that all that's going on here is a bunch of physical processes. That's all that's going on here. How is it that the aardvark, let's use an aardvark, I'm talking about and thinking about an aardvark in my head, and when I talk to another person about the aardvark, they get the same image or impression in their head. When there's no aardvark around, right? How is it that we're able to communicate meaningfully about the same object, given that the electrical impulses in his brain are different from the electrical impulses in chemical reactions in my brain? How is it that there is some way in which the universal notion or concept of an aardvark, which is nowhere around, is able to meaningfully be transmitted from one to the other? Now, the typical, maybe a little bit higher IQ atheist at this point will say, well, that's a neat question, but it's simply answered by saying that you at one time recorded an image of a aardvark through your eye cameras, and because you're a blank slate, the biological camera that is your brain, computer camera, recorded it, and this other dude recorded it as well. He knows what an aardvark is, and so the symbols triggered this sort of similar imagery to come to mind because you used the vocal cords aardvark that brought it to mind. Well, the problem here is that we don't know that we are thinking of the same thing. We also don't know how it is that we mean the same thing. Now, yeah, we might talk about it and further define our concepts and, get an approximation that we are thinking of the same thing in aardvark. But these electrical impulses themselves are not going to show us that we're actually talking about the same thing. So in other words, we're getting into a deeper question of universals, because there's no aardvark around. We're not talking about that there are no essences on this view. So how is it that we are able to meaningfully discuss something that is nowhere present, that both of our minds seem to somehow grasp and understand? And this is ultimately the question that Plato asked a long time ago. And again, I'm not making a Plato third man argument. That's not the point here. The point here is just that question that Plato asked, right? We're not talking about a particular single aardvark, because the aardvark I might be thinking of probably looks different than the one that the other dude's thinking of. He might have saw an aardvark on the Discovery Channel. I might have seen it in something I Googled, right? So that particular being or animal that I'm thinking of is not the same particular thing that he's thinking of, well, how is it possible that we're having a meaningful exchange about this subject? Because we're talking about two different things, right? Well, the clever atheist responds at this point with, well, okay, but you're just talking about the same classification that you two guys have, right? So, yeah, there's no aardvarkness out there in the world. There's no essence of aardvark or form of that, animal or something like that. You guys are just talking about a similar symbolic token classification that society has given. We just call it an aardvark. We could have called it ghetto booty if we wanted to. It wouldn't matter. It would still be just an aardvark. So the taxonomy, the names that we've given to it don't matter, says the atheist. It's just the same classification structure that you and the other guy know. Well, my response there is, well, wait a minute. You haven't really answered the question. Because what's in my mind and what's in his mind are not classification structures, right? Because those aren't material things. In our minds are these images of different aardvarks. Let me give you another example, Mr. Atheist, to make this point even clearer. When we talk about the number 7, when I think about the number 7, and when you think about the number 7, let's say for the sake of argument that you don't imagine in your head, any actual number or image of 7. Maybe the Roman numerals V and then, II, or, maybe I'm thinking of, 7 apples. Maybe you're thinking of, the actual Arabic numeral 7 or something. None of these are the same in themselves, right? 7 apples is not the same as Roman numerals VII. But 7 is still there somehow, right? How is that? And we can't just say it's a social construct, token, symbol, categorization, because that just moves the problem back a step. Okay, so it's a token symbol. Well, if it's a social construct, how is it that social constructs like 7 operate universally all over the planet and invariantly over all times? Right? Social constructs would be humanly created. They wouldn't have the principle of being objective, immaterial, and invariant across the board, across cultures, and across time. Right? So the number 7 was still doing its 7 thing for the Greeks, as it is for us today, as it is in China. And that should be pretty obvious, right? And it is at this point that the atheist materialist is just completely flustered across the board. I've had this debate, I don't know how many times, probably 150 times. Because this is really the crux of where we're at. We need universals. We need these kinds of objective metaphysical categories and principles. There's no answer for them. There's no explanation for them on the kind of worldview presented by these people. This, my friends, is a transcendental argument. So what I just gave is a great example of a transcendental argument. Now, I'm sure the atheist, questionable listeners, the inquiring skeptics who will hear this, will have all kinds of responses. I'm sure I'll get some, a bunch of emails and comments and so on saying, well, you didn't understand, blah, 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 your argument's dumb, blah, blah, blah. Now, look, again, let's just make it really, really clear and drive it home. The number 7. When I write the number 7 on a chalkboard, is that the number 7? In one sense, it's the number 7. But in another sense, it's not the number 7, because if I erase it, 7 hasn't completely disappeared from the face of the earth, right? So how is it then that we can have instantiations of a thing? We can have particular symbolic images of a thing, and yet when we erase them, they seem to have this invariant, unchanging, unalterable character about them. On the atheist perspective and worldview, there is no way for those kinds of things to be, because there are no possible objective unifying principles. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that things like 7 are not dependent upon human knowledge, human creation, human invention, human thought. They are independent of them, right? But the number 7 is also not out there in the world. It's not like it's out there laying under a rock somewhere. I found the number 7. It was it was in my sock drawer. Now the world can be happy. We have 7 back because I found it under my sock drawer, in my sock drawer. No. There has to be some other way for numbers to be. So that's what I'm getting at. And this is an example of a transcendental argument. Now granted, the transcendental argument is applied to, say, numbers or concepts or universals. That may not immediately prove everything that we want to about God directly, right? We have to attach other points and other data points and other principles and knowledge, yes. But ultimately, yes, it does follow that the only coherent explanation for how these things can be is God. And that's where we're going with this. So I might have started with a more advanced example of a transcendental argument, but other versions of this can be given. The more clear, the more simple version is when we give the ethical version and we say, well, if there's no God, then everything is permissible. That's what Dostoevsky said. But when we scratch an atheist, when we punch an atheist, when Dawkins is robbed, I feel sure that he will have a sense of moral indignation. And the ultimate point with that is just that there's not really any reason for indignation. I mean, you may not personally like it. There's not really a reason for it, right? But now if there's a God and there is objective right and wrong, moral absolutes, then there is a reason. Without God, there's no reason at all for anything. And whatever happens just happens. Killing 1 million people is not any more or less moral or advantageous than a nation having 1 million births. And there's no qualitative difference between one or the other. They're just events. And in the atheist materialist worldview, events are completely leveled. They're just events. They're just phenomena, because ultimately it's just chemicals reacting. There's no difference between. You may not like it. You think of Bertrand Russell's famous essay, "Why I'm Not a Christian," and he levels all these arguments about, that are just fallacies and emotional appeals. He says, "Well, you're weak. You can't rely on logic and science. You're this or that. A lot of which is he's directing at red herrings and people that have presented bad arguments." But the presentation is not a logical presentation. It's just an emotional appeal. And in the same way, as the atheist, you may not like bad things happening to you or people stealing from you. But the only thing you can come up with as a response is either, well, that's not what I like, or society has decided otherwise. right? So there's some sort of a social construct version of morals, which is completely, obviously laughable, because you can socially engineer a society to believe anything. So on this view, there was nothing wrong with Aztecs sacrificing 10,000 people a day. That was perfectly acceptable for the Aztecs, because that was what was socially constructed for them. And today we've socially constructed the view that, well, I don't even know what we would say is the socially acceptable view of morals in, say, modern America. I mean, it's just all over the board. So ultimately, the social construct view of morals is just complete nonsense. There's no content there at all. It doesn't say anything. And by the way, which society? I mean, is it local? So if rape is allowed in, one state, and I drive to the state where it isn't, and I do it, does it then become? I mean, it's just nonsense. There's no content to that view. It's so elastic that it can mean everything, anything, and everything, and nothing. So, so there's a couple examples of the application of a transcendental argument. But from here, we want to take it into, a deeper questions about the status of them, how strong are they, which I've already kind of hinted at, but we're going to go further in that direction. And then we're going to talk about theories of truth, coherence theory of truth versus the classical foundationalist versions of truth. And then we'll talk more about presuppositions, talk more about how it is that there are preconditions for even having truth. So all of these ultimately are just questions that the atheist, materialist, and most philosophers, and even most theists, most religious people, apologists, blah blah blah. They're just realms that these people haven't gone to, questions they haven't asked or thought about or know about, and so this is just an area that's so just unknown. Okay, so what I really want to do is make this known, make this more public, more accessible. And point out that although on the surface a lot of this seems really obscure and technical maybe, really it's not. I mean, we can give really simple versions of all these points and principles that are accessible to anybody that are still transcendental arguments, right? Like the moral point, like, well, if there's no God, everything's permissible. That's a transcendental argument. So what I want to do then is say, well, what would be what's the typical response to if there's no God, everything is permissible? The typical response is, okay, well, that doesn't prove anything. So maybe there is a God. Which God? How do we know? Right? So we'll go from there. So what is the status of a transcendental argument in terms of strength, strictly speaking? Well, I've said before that they are I think the strongest form of argumentation that we have, because they're actually the preconditions for how we can have arguments or truth at all. So they're kind of a higher metaphysical, epistemic, and metaphysical category for creating the possibility for knowledge or for ultimately metaphysics of being or the world at all. Insofar as this world is constituted, and insofar as humans are constituted in this life, transcendental arguments form the strongest version of argumentation. So, like the question we mentioned earlier of the law of non-contradiction, with Aristotle and the sophists, when Aristotle gives the transcendental argument for the law of non-contradiction, what he actually shows is that this is a higher level, or a more foundational level, however you want to put the analogy, version of logic or truth or principle that undergirds and creates the possibility for the law of non-contradiction itself to be the case. So, a good example, I'm going to read from, this is philosopher Hilary Putnam. And Putnam, of course, would not agree with all the things that I'm saying, or I want to take transcendental arguments where I think they go, particularly with God. But his comments here do highlight some of what we're getting at. And this is from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on Transcendental Arguments. And in my grad classes, we did get to read a good bit of Putnam, so I do have a pretty decent familiarity with where he goes in this regard. But it says Putnam is keen to emphasize the transcendental nature of his enterprise in this respect. He stresses that the kinds of constraints on reference that operate here disprove. Basically, it's talking about skepticism, and Putnam's trying to give a transcendental argument against skepticism, which is really it's sort of the most common usage of it, and that makes sense because ultimately materialistic, atheistic, non-believing worldviews end up in some kind of skepticism. They can't provide any kind of real objective principle. But to quote Putnam, he says, "What we've been doing is considering the preconditions for thinking about, representing, and referring. We have investigated these preconditions not by investigating the meanings of words and phrases like a linguist might, but by reasoning a priori, not in the old absolute sense, but in the sense of inquiring into what is reasonably possible, assuming certain general premises, or making certain very broad theoretical assumptions. Such a procedure is not empirical, nor not quite a priori," which point I've made before, "but has elements of both ways of investigating. In spite of the fallibility of my procedure, its dependence upon assumptions which might be described as empirical. My procedure has a close relation to what Kant called a transcendental investigation, for it is an investigation and repeat of the preconditions of reference and hence of thought, preconditions built into the nature of our minds themselves, though not, as Kant hoped, wholly independent of empirical assumptions." Exactly. And this is where we need to discuss Kant, because Kant really, really forged forward with the idea of transcendental argumentation. But we have to be very careful and have to be very clear, because the next confusion or question or objection that everyone has at this point generally is, "Oh, you're Kantian. This is all from Kant. This is..." No. A transcendental argument in its form is independent of Kant and his opinions and theories about things. Kant was ultimately working with empiricist presuppositions and assumptions and gave a kind of transcendental argumentation that was only about the human mind itself. So for Kant, the human mind, forms all these categories of these preconditions of experience. No. That is absurd. That is, in fact, what I just argued against above in the or earlier in the the point with the number 7 or with the aardvark. The principle here is not empirical, and like Putnam says, it's also not completely a priori, because we are going to engage in aspects of experience. But Kant thought that we could not, have any knowledge or certainty of the external world. So he has the divide between the phenomenal and the noumenal. We do have these phenomena of experience, and we know all about that, and we can categorize and classify that. But we don't know the world out there. So, we can actually do a transcendental critique of Kant, because Kant's assumption is that other minds work the same way as his mind that he's examining. Well, by definition, Kant has no knowledge, no ability to know how other minds work, because that's part of the noumenal realm. So Kant's philosophy works on a whole bunch of assumptions that he also did not
question or engage in. Rather, what we are saying is that some of the insights that Kant has about categories or preconditions of experience, those are objective metaphysical principles and truths. So we're simply saying that Kant's divide between the phenomenal and noumenal is false. That is an empirical construct. And I've quoted and given points where other philosophers have refuted this argument in Kant. Particularly, Husserl responds forcefully to Kant's error here. But Putnam gives us an example here with what kind of a thing we're doing here. It's more along the lines of a priori argumentation, which is not based on empirical claims, more like mathematics. And it's not Kant, right? So we're not. We must be careful here of the error of fallacy of association. Where when Kant said transcendental, you're saying that you are Kantian and this is all Enlightenment stuff. No. This is 100% anti-Enlightenment skepticism and empiricism. And again, this goes back to Aristotle, right? So, Aristotle is not a skeptic. Of course, I would have disagreements with Aristotle's philosophy in many regards, as a person who is more in line with biblical views and, patristic investigation and analysis. Of these questions, but we're also not wholly agreeing with Aristotle, but we can make the point that Aristotle is not. Aristotle uses transcendental arguments. He's not a Kantian. Okay, yeah, you might argue that ultimately Aristotle's errors lead to Kant, but there's nothing about talking about a precondition of experience that necessitates us in adopting all these other crazy things in Kant. And that's another big misunderstanding that people have. And even Putnam here, makes the point that he's not, Kant thought that he was doing a transcendental idealism, but ultimately you can't escape the empirical world. The empirical world is real, it's there. All of these claims that we're making have clear empirical import and reference. So, another important point to make when we do this kind of reasoning and argumentation in response to atheists, materialists, etc., is the point of what Dr. Bahnsen called the crackers in the pantry fallacy. And you have to constantly explain this and make this point because the materialist assumption and presupposition, which is what we're doing in this kind of argumentation, is critiquing those presuppositions, is that all arguments are proved the same way. So everything, this goes back to that question of proving things and the problem of what exactly we mean by proving things and levels of certainty and so forth. The materialist, version of proof, 99% of the time is, again, just some sort of positivist, empiricist, empirical collection of facts and then, judgment and jury by the brain or whatever. Well, if we are going to discuss objects that transcend empirical experience, obviously the way that we would prove them is not the same way that we would prove whether there are crackers in the pantry. So what happens is when we're discussing something like God or something immaterial and we're talking about proofs for those things, What the atheist does is sort of poison the well or skew the discussion from the outset by saying, where is the physical proof of God? Right? This is the Dawkins kind of thing. Like, where's the flying spaghetti monster, stuff like that. This also is a very common error for the pop, Reddit neckbeard atheist types. Well, it should be obvious that something that we're saying has the characteristics of being immaterial and invariant and unchanging and not bound by or altered by, physical manifestations is not going to be proven in the same way that physical things are, by the very fact that we're claiming, believing that it is not like those things. So, it's like saying, literally, it's like saying, I'm not going to believe that 2 + 2 = 4 until you show me that, there's, until I can find the number 2 and the number 2 and the number 4. Right? I mean, that's a nonsense question, right? Because the type of thing that we're talking about is not material. Yeah, you can have material manifestations of 2 items and 2 items and say that they're 4 items, but you're not experiencing. You're not showing by that the actual number 2 and the actual number 4. These are just examples of those things. So if you were to ask the question, how do we know, or the law of logic, or the laws of logic, or the law of non-contradiction is true, and until I see physical proof of the law of non-contradiction, I'm not going to believe it. You're talking about things that, by their very nature, are prior to empirical experience, and that's the point here. That's the crucial point. Something prior to physical experience, empirical experience, something that's a precondition for, by its very nature, cannot be demonstrated or proven in the same way that something that is empirical is proven or demonstrated or known. And that should be obvious. And so when we talk about God, I don't want to equate God with numbers or logic, but God is the source of numbers and logic. And so they do bear a clear relation to him and have their origin in him. And in that regard, logical, mathematical truths and principles are closer to the kind of argumentation that we would give for God than, classical, what's called evidentialist apologetics. The idea that, the apostles rose from the dead, when Jesus rose from the dead, and the apostles were changed after that, so therefore Jesus rose from the dead. That's a very, very bad argument. May be true, but also might not be true, given the unbelieving worldview. Maybe guys just rise from the dead. Maybe maybe this was a freak occurrence. Maybe it was maybe the apostles had mental issues and they just turned into sort of fearless, crazed guys after that. Again, the point being that you're not getting anywhere with that kind of argument. It's incidental to the religion as a whole, and it depends on more foundational prior questions. Is Christianity or is religion or is theism true as a whole? Right? Those questions are going to condition how you interpret the evidence, such as apostles having their lives changed. I mean, there might be Buddhists who have their lives changed after some experience. Right? So changing lives really has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of the worldview as a whole. People change their lives all the time. Maybe Muslims change their lives after they convert to Islam. So it really has nothing to do. Again, this doesn't prove anything. It's only going to be useful insofar as the religion itself is true or false. So that's just, again, and that's why this is such a better version and form of apologetic or argumentation or presentation than any kind of evidentialist view, right? And that's not to say that evidences don't have a place, but that when you bring forth a bunch of facts, the assumption there, like, the apostles changing their lives after Jesus was resurrected, they went from fearful to bold. When you bring forth a fact or an evidence like that, that really only has force insofar as, again, the religion itself is true, and it also has this faulty character of giving the impression that it's not clear whether there's a God. Because, again, that argument presents a degree of skepticism and uncertainty, and, it's usually followed up by things like, well, you got to take a leap of faith, and, fideism, and, we can't know about theism or God really with any certainty. We just kind of have to marshal up a bunch of facts and have this case, and, then hopefully we can make the leap and we'll be right in the long run. That's all terrible. That's terrible, terrible argumentation, terrible apologetics. And it really does a disservice to the religion in terms of what we actually think we believe about it. And it also, gives the wrong impression to non-believers that, this is just silly. If this is the best kind of argument you've got, well, why would I believe that? It's silly. It's dumb. That's a terrible argument. So if your religion has terrible arguments, then what you say is supposed to be true about this God isn't true. Is he the Lord of logic? If he's the Lord of logic, which you would say according to your religion, why are your arguments so illogical? Right. So evidences only have force insofar as they are part of a correct precondition or presupposition. And until you challenge those presuppositions for the atheist or the materialist or whatever, he's always going to interpret such facts insofar as they line up with his presuppositions. In other words, it's a filter. He's got this materialist filter on any kind of incidental fact that you bring up like that. So for him, it's just, well, they made it up. They made it up that he resurrected, or it was a freak occurrence that science hasn't explained yet. Some guy, passed out for a few days and he woke back up. So because you haven't challenged the assumptions of his whole system, which are assumptions of human autonomy, rebellion against God, so forth. That's why the argument is no good and why it fails. In other words, until you take out the foundation of his mental castle that he's built, of unbelief and rebellion, you're not going to make much headway. Right? The fool has said in his heart, "There's no God." So the presentation, according to Revelation, about the person who is an atheist is not that he's an intellectual and the Christian is the, leap of faith fideist. It's the reverse, right? Revelation is intellectual, and the atheist has the leap of faith foolishness that is characteristic of his worldview. And that's important, right? Because, we need to do the kind of apologetic and methodology that God reveals, not the kind of methodology and apologetic that we think is more palatable. And that is ultimately the big flaw with classical, quote unquote, Thomistic style evidential apologetics, is that it ultimately leaves the final court of appeal about God's existence in the hands of man. But the way that Revelation describes God is that God does not give man the final court of appeal about his existence, as if God is on trial, and then, if enough humans, give a thumbs up, to his existence, then God's existence will be proven. Otherwise, well, it's just all up in the air. We don't know. Maybe God exists. Maybe no. That's all silly. Again, because what are the implications for epistemology and metaphysics if the God of the Bible exists, given what he says about his existence, right? So if God does exist, according to what the biblical narrative and revelation presents, then he is the precondition for knowledge and experience and logic and mathematics and science, period. And so you couldn't do those things if there wasn't the kind of God that exists. Now you might say, well, how could that be? That's crazy. But no, you're making such a strong claim. There's no way you could prove that. I mean, that's just so far-fetched from the standard mode of apologetics that most believers engage in. Most theists in general, even. This is unheard of. And it's unheard of, not so much because it's difficult or hard per se. I mean, it might be, there are technical aspects of this argumentation, but it's so revolutionary in the sense of being opposite of what we're conditioned to that it seems hard to believe. It seems hard to believe that there could be, proof for God, like absolutely certain proof, like that God's existence is more certain than anything else. And it seems so far-fetched and revolutionary, not because of the force of its logic, but just because of what we're used to. And that's what's so big here. That's what's so huge and so difficult. We're just so used to, as humans, being conditioned in a fallen world to doubt, to unbelief, to empiricism, that any argument constructed in this way, presented in this way, making this kind of a strong claim, just seems astounding. Nevertheless, it turns out much of our world, as it really is astounding. Much of the world is hard to believe. Is it hard to believe because there's a fault in the argument? Or is it hard to believe because there's a fault in man? And that's really what we're getting at here. Because when you get into this kind of a discussion, so often the response, the criticism, the objection is that, well, people, if this was true, then we'd all believe in God. Well, no. Something being true doesn't mean that people necessarily accept it. I mean, people lie all the time. And the biblical presentation is that man is fallen in rebellion against God. And that's what's key here, right? So the flaw in the certainty of God's existence is not found in God. It's not found in the presentation of creation or in, there's not a flaw in philosophy or logic, or it's not like God didn't present enough proof, like maybe God presented 75%, good evidence, and then there's 25%, of the facts are, maybe against God, and, we'll just kind of have to throw our weight in, like with some kind of Pascalian wager, towards thinking maybe God exists. No. Again, let's think about it from the perspective of God existing and from what's revealed. There's no question of God's existence, right? I mean, look at the way God speaks in Revelation. Does he ever speak like, well, I know it's kind of unclear whether I'm here or not, but hey, trust me, I'm here. No, it's always like certain, right? He castigates Israel over and over and over for not believing. Well, how could he castigate Israel over and over and over for not believing if he had failed to present the clarity of his own existence, right? So it's crazy. And this was a good point that Van Til made for all of his theological errors and points in Calvinism I would disagree with. But this point is great, and it still holds true because it's faithful to revelation. It's faithful to, ultimately, I think, what even the church fathers present. Because even though there may not be, an explicit transcendental argument in, Basil or somebody, that doesn't mean that what's being said here isn't true, because the idea is still there. Transcendental arguments, quote unquote, is something that really wasn't examined or thought about in this way until modern philosophy. So just because a name is used or an idea comes up in modern philosophy, it doesn't mean it's bad. It's just any more than quantum physics isn't discussed in the church fathers directly. So we're not going to say that that's bad because they didn't have an idea yet of that level of atomic reality, or subatomic, excuse me. Right. So just because there's not a explicit reference or usage of the terminology shouldn't really scare anybody away or be a question of of it being dangerous or something like that. When you really understand what this is, far from being dangerous, this is actually what's needed. Right, so this change in thought, and Van Til was right to call it a revolution in apologetics, because it's in apologetics it's not revolutionary in the sense of overturning traditional theology or traditional metaphysics. It's a revolution in apologetics in making Christian or biblical revelational theology and metaphysics make sense with what God says about Himself. That's what's key. And the classical arguments that are principally really summed up in Aquinas, and there's a lot of problems there, are based on an epistemology that's called classical foundationalism. Now that's somewhat anachronistic because in his day it didn't have that title. The title comes about later, but it's a title that describes a specific kind of epistemology. And it's an empirical epistemology ultimately. And it's an empirical theology. And so because there's not an empirical theology, this is why ultimately the Thomistic method and the classical, quote-unquote, traditional Roman style of apologetics doesn't work. It's not good argumentation. And it's not good argumentation because it doesn't take into account the revelation that God gives about Himself in His existence when it does apologetics. It gives too much place to fallen man's intellectual reasoning and status and ability, as opposed to grounding certainty about metaphysics in revelation, or about metaphysics in revelation, and a grounding epistemology in revelation. And that's what's unique. Whereas for Thomism, autonomous man, unbelieving human thought, is able to reason to the certainty of God's existence on its own, and then later you tack on whether God is personal or not. So you can reason to the point of, through classical ideas like teleology and cosmology. For the teleological argument and the cosmological argument, you can reason through those to the point where you think that there's one, first cause. But whether or not that first cause is personal or impersonal or whatever, that all comes on through revelation. You tack that on from revelation. No. You don't reason at all without revelation. That's the point. You couldn't have human cognition at all without revelation. And I don't mean by that like if you haven't read the Bible, like you can't know things. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that the metaphysics presented, the epistemology presented in Revelation must be the case, or the precondition for how humans are able to have knowledge. And that's the key. That's crucial. So make a note of that if you're taking notes. That's the point. Because again, it's misunderstood. People think you're saying, oh, so you're saying I don't know anything if I don't know the Bible? Well, you can have knowledge of the world and you've learned things. You know your name and 2 + 2 is 4, something like that. But you don't understand that you need a revolution in your thought, a metanoia in your mind, a turning of your mind to understand that you're not able to do any of that. The precondition for you to be able to do that is the existence of the kind of God presented in Revelation. Well, how is that? Because to deny him is to destroy the possibility of any of those things. Because God, ultimately, what we're saying here is that any one of these transcendental preconditions, right, we could step it back and do a kind of a higher level. Like, what's the transcendental precondition for transcendental categories? God. That's the argument. That's it. Right there. So, let me say it again. We have preconditions for experience. We have preconditions for metaphysics and all these things, right? What things seem to have to be the case for intelligibility. But we don't just stop there because, somebody might come along and say, okay, well, yeah, you can go, I'll be a transcendental philosopher, but I don't believe in God. They're just these categories. Well, just like we asked the question of metalogic, and we said, well, what's the logic of logic? We're going to ask the same question and say, well, what is the precondition for all of these preconditions for humans? So human conceptual preconditions, right, for the possibility of knowledge and for the possibility of interacting in the world and so forth, having conversations, language, meaning, numbers, blah, blah, blah. What holds those things together? How is that possible? Like, how is it possible that the world is constructed in this way such that we can have knowledge and do all this stuff? And the answer is that we need a being, we need a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, etc., that has all those attributes that is able to string all of these facts together, right? So these universals, these categories that we talked about from Plato, aardvarkness, sevenness, etc. It's not enough to just speak about essences. It's not enough to just say, well, there's categories, there's essences. They're just out there. Because ultimately that's irrational. And this is ultimately where Plato's philosophy falls off. And it makes a good point in getting us past materialism and raising the questions about, immaterial metaphysical substrates or principles or so forth. But that's not enough, because the presentation of God in the Bible is not merely that he's just some abstract principle. On the contrary, he's personal. He's covenantal, or he makes a covenant. So the relation with God is not abstract intellectualism, it's personal. And that's not to say that, then therefore numbers are bad and metaphysics is bad, and because they're abstract. No. They're abstract only in one sense, because ultimately they're personal. That's the key. And that's what's, again, that's a massively revolutionary claim. Revolutionary in the sense of the way most men think, not revolutionary in the sense of truth, not like some French revolutionary, rejecting, theology. No. Revolutionary, counter-revolutionary against, atheistic fallen man. That's what we're saying. So yeah, maybe we should present it that way, that transcendental argumentation is the ultimate counter-revolutionary argumentation. Because man ultimately with the devil has chosen to rebel. So, so I'm hoping I'm making myself clear. As I'm sitting here doing this, I'm thinking about, what would skeptics and what would the opposition say? You're constantly running through the opposing sides' line of argumentation, how they're gonna perceive this and what they're gonna say in response. And usually in this kind of argumentation presentation, what I've been doing for, I'd say, 15 years, no, maybe not that long, 13, having had this debate and this discussion so many times, at this point, usually what happens is the person that you're explaining to is kind of lost. They're kind of like, you lost me when you went from, transcendental categories to God, right? I don't know, how'd you make that leap? That's where I don't buy it. Well, we're saying that the existence of God is certain, and it's just as certain or more certain than merely transcendental categories, because critics make the error of mistaking chronological priority or presentation with metaphysical priority or epistemic priority in presentation, right? So this is the point that I made at the very beginning, that just because something is indirect doesn't have really anything to do with the truth or falsity of things that are implied by it, right? And this is a common mistake in metaphysics and in philosophy. People make it all the time, where it's like, because you present something first in time, or chronologically, or in a proposition or something, that somehow that means it has like actual metaphysical priority. No. There's no reason to think that. In other words, the ordering of something, unless you're talking about time itself or something, unless you're trying to make an argument about when things happened, I guess then chronological priority would have significance. But when we're talking about things that are immaterial and invariant, chronological priority really has nothing to do with the truth or falsity of it. It's just really irrelevant to it. Basil makes this point when he's arguing against, and I think Gregory of Nyssa too, when he's arguing against different sectarians. He says, just because the Father is presented as the fountainhead of deity, or the starting point of the Godhead, it doesn't follow from that the Son is of lesser metaphysical significance or power. There's just no reason to assume that priority in presentation leads to some sort of lesser status to what follows. So when it comes to arguing for certainty about God from preconditions or categories, so forth, I mean, there's just no reason to think that. It's just a logical error that so many people make. So when we look at all these preconditions and these things that seem to need to be the case, we need universals, we need these invariant mathematical entities, so forth, and we say, all right, look, let's say these things are real. Well, they can't just be floating out there in the ether, because if they're just impersonal, which, a number just considered as a number is just an impersonal thing, or law of logic just out there as a abstract principle. Well, abstract principles don't have the characteristic of having purpose. So we can bring in telos at this point. We can say they don't really do anything. They don't give meaning in themselves. They just kind of are. Hence they're abstract, impersonal principles. So what we actually need for meaning is a sort of a macrocosmic version of how the human mind works. We need a divine mind. And just like these principles and ideas can be contained in my mind, and because I am a person and not just a collection of chemicals and scientific datum, or I'm not just a big computer, there's another aspect to my being which is personal. We can say it's clear then that what really strings all this together is the divine mind. And so the human mind is a kind of analogy or an analog to the divine mind, although a very imperfect and pale image of it. It is an image of it, right? And so we have an incarnation then that explains how this is possible, when the divine mind actually did become incarnate in a human mind. So we have an even greater model there with the Logos. And so all these facts of experience, all these principles that we encounter, laws of logic, mathematics out there, universals out there, the stuff that we interact with, what brings all these things together? That's the key question at this point, right? So the Greek philosophers, were able to get far enough to say there are these abstract impersonal principles out there, these metaphysical principles. But they did not have an impersonal, omniscient, omnipotent God that linked these things together. That Van Til had a good analogy. He said, what strings this chain? What strings the chain of pearls together? Like we have this pearl here, and this pearl here, and this fact there, and this fact there. But we need an objective unifying principle to bring all of these things together to work in coherence. Because what good is it to say, well, there are abstract logical principles, and there are abstract metaphysical principles like universals, but maybe they're like two competing forces. Maybe they fight against each other or something. Maybe they're abstract forces in tension. Maybe they're just like forces of nature out there or something. Well, if that's the case, then they're not coherent. They don't work together. They're not in unison, or they're not symmetrical. They don't work in harmony. But clearly, because we can talk about mathematics and logic and universals together, they seem to work together. And so what does all this point to? Well, it points to a single divine mind. It points to all of these things being held together by a single objective unifying metaphysical principle that is logical, that is omniscient, that is the divine mind. And that's where we get to the point where we say, well, there's only really one religion that presents it this way, and that is, the theology presented in biblical theology, and particularly in Eastern theology, because Eastern theology presents the logoi, which are the archetypes or principles of things, the same idea as Plato's forms, but presents them in the divine mind, the divine logos. The logoi, principles of things, are all one in the logos. And it has then its clearer presentation in Eastern thinkers like Maximus the Confessor, with his principles of the logoi, and in more recent Eastern writers like Dr. Philip Sherrard, who in many essays and articles gives this kind of argumentation. And I will post links to those below. Feel free to put your comments. Hopefully we can have an enlightening discussion and really kind of make this form of argumentation known, because it's so powerful and so it's such a shift in paradigm in thinking as to what we are used to in standard metaphysics, theology, apologetics, and presentation.